In Tokyo, space is a luxury. So when Sora found a studio apartment in Shinjuku for a third of the market price, he didn't care about the rumors. He signed the lease right away. The apartment was spotless: clean floors, fresh paint, no obvious signs of damage, except for one odd detail. In the far corner of the ceiling, a tiny bright red thread hung down from beneath the wallpaper, just a few inches long. Sora noticed it on his first night, and since he was curious, he reached up and gave it a tug. It didn't budge. It felt as though the thread was anchored deep inside the concrete wall. After a few attempts, he shrugged and went to bed. By the third night, something had changed. Sora suddenly woke up at 2 a.m. The room felt unusually cold, the kind of cold that makes you want to tuck your blanket tighter around you. Half asleep, he looked across the dark apartment, toward the corner, toward the thread. He froze. The thread was longer, much longer. It now hung halfway down the wall. Sora sat upright. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He got out of bed and crossed the room. The floorboards felt icy beneath his bare feet. When he reached the corner, he wrapped his fingers around the thread and pulled. This time, it moved, slow and smooth, almost too easily. More of the thread emerged from the ceiling. It gathered in his hand like a coil of copper wire, except it didn't feel like wire. It felt warm, slightly damp. Sora frowned and pulled again. More emerged, and more, and more, until suddenly the thread went taut. Something on the other side of the wall pulled back, hard. Sora stumbled forward. His heart hammered against his ribs. For a moment, neither side moved. He stood there, gripping the thread. Whatever was attached to it seemed to be gripping it too. Slowly, Sora leaned closer to the wall. Then he pressed his ear against the wallpaper. At first, he heard nothing, just silence. And then, a sound, a wet, raspy breath, coming from somewhere inside the wall. The breath drew closer until it seemed to be right beside his ear. And then a tiny voice whispered through the plaster, a child's voice, weak, almost grateful. Thank you for pulling me up. There is a stretch of highway in Malaysia where the streetlights end and the jungle swallows the road whole. Drivers call it the dead zone. At 2 o'clock one morning, Malik's motorcycle chain snapped. The sound echoed through the darkness. Then everything went silent. And the silence of a tropical jungle at night isn't peaceful. The air felt thick and heavy. The smell of wet earth hangs in the air. And sometimes something else. As Malik pushed his motorcycle to the side of the road, he caught the unmistakable scent of jasmine. That was the first sign. Now, according to old stories, Malik knew the warnings. He'd heard them his whole life. But when you're stranded alone in the middle of nowhere, logic has a way of pushing superstition aside. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, not a single bar. And then he heard it, a sound from the tall grass beside the road. Something heavy, moving slowly beside him. Malik turned toward the noise and switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. And then he found something standing near the tree line. A figure, wrapped tightly in white cloth. The fabric was bound around the feet, around the ankles, and above the head. A burial shroud. It was a pekong. Now, the pekong is a ghost from Indonesian and Malaysian folklore. It is said to be a soul trapped on earth because its burial shroud knots were not untied, and hence it roamed the villages feeling trapped in the afterlife. Malik stopped breathing. The figure remained perfectly still. The jungle around it seemed to fall even quieter. Then the flashlight beam drifted upward towards its face, or where its face should have been. The cloth had rotted away in places. Beneath it was a dark, hollow skin. It had no eyes and no expression. It was almost as if it didn't seem human. Malik felt his stomach tighten. The old stories came rushing back. If you see one, don't run, don't scream, because a pekong doesn't walk, it hops. And if it decides to follow you, it moves faster than it should. The figure leaned forward. It was now standing on the road. Malik's hands trembled. The phone slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the asphalt. The screen cracked. A pale blue light spilled across the ground. In that reflection, he saw the figure tilt its head downward, looking directly at him. Another hop. It got closer and even closer. The next morning, people found Malik sitting beside his motorcycle. He was alive and didn't seem to have any injuries. But according to everyone who knew him, he never spoke another word, not for the rest of his life. My mom shared this story with me when I was young. It happened around the time she was still in school. Now, this isn't a first hand account. The story revolves around a boy who lived in her neighborhood. Over the years, a lot of speculation grew around what really happened. So just take it with a grain of salt. Many people from that era still insist the events happened exactly as they were told. And before anyone asks me why my mom shared horror stories with me, I should probably mention that I was already obsessed with them. And stories like this were my favorites. There was a boy who lived nearby and attended a public school. He was incredibly mischievous, always getting into trouble, distracting other students. He often found himself thrown out of class. What people did not know was that he kept mostly to himself. He didn't have many friends and certainly wasn't popular. Most teachers gave up on him, and most students avoided him. But there was one teacher who refused to do either, and that was Mrs. Sarojini. She was the school's math teacher, a strict and disciplined lady, the kind of teacher who could silence an entire classroom with a single look. Despite her stern reputation, she took an interest in the boy. Perhaps he reminded her of someone, or she simply saw potential where everyone else saw a problem. Whatever the reason, she simply refused to give up on him. The boy's home life wasn't particularly unusual for that era. He lived with his parents and six siblings. As you know, families were large back then, and resources were often stretched thin. The older children usually received the most attention, while the younger ones learned to fend for themselves. It's possible he felt overlooked, acting out as the only way to get noticed. He was intelligent, but he struggled to focus. Perhaps today we might speculate about attention disorders, but those conversations rarely ever happened back then. Mrs. Sarojini concluded that if she wanted to help him, she would have to be persistent. She began keeping him after school. Officially, it looked like punishment. To him, it felt like detention. But to Mrs. Sarojini, it was something else, her way of guiding him, perhaps a kind of motherly affection. And so, the tutoring continued, week after week, month after month, until 2 years passed. By the time he reached the 10th grade, Mrs. Sarojini had become a constant presence in his life. She still kept him back after school, checking on his homework, and singling him out in class. The other students began calling him the teacher's pet, not out of cruelty, but simply to tease him. As the final exams approached, anxiety spread across the class. They weren't ordinary exams, these were the state board exams, a major milestone that students prepared for months. sometimes years in advance. Failing wasn't just embarrassing, it could change the course of their life. One afternoon, during a study session, the pressure finally got to him. He burst into tears. I can't do this, he cried. I'm going to fail. Mrs. Sarojini remained calm, reassuring him. You are not going to fail. You just need to focus on these questions and keep revising. But her words didn't help. He curled into himself and kept repeating, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, over and over again. Finally, Mrs. Sarojini made a decision. It was a rather strange one. She instructed him to tell the entire class to return the following evening at 5:30 p.m. The boy looked at her in confusion. The whole class? He asked. She nodded, offering no explanation, only the instructions. And so he agreed. The next morning, he quietly wrote a note on the blackboard. Mrs. Sarojini requests that all students remain after school and return to the classroom at 5:30 p.m. He didn't want to answer any questions or face blame, so he made it look as though the teacher herself had written it. When math period arrived, the students immediately noticed something unusual. Mrs. Sarojini wasn't there. A substitute teacher had taken her place. Whispers spread across the classroom. Maybe she's sick? Does this mean we don't have to stay back? By recess, the class representative stood up and settled the debate. If Mrs. Sarojini asked us to meet her at 5:30, then that's what we'll do. And so the decision was made. The students returned after school and gathered in the classroom. 5:30 came and went. No Mrs. Sarojini. At first, nobody seemed concerned, but as time passed, unease settled in. 6 o'clock, then 6:40. The mood shifted. Students became restless. A teacher walking past stopped and looked inside. Why are you still here? She asked. The class representative explained. The teacher frowned, saying she hadn't seen Mrs. Sarojini all day. If she doesn't arrive soon, you all should head home. Nervous glances exchanged. The classroom fell silent. The boy was sitting at the back of the class, anxiously fidgeting. If his other classmates found out that he had written the message on the board, convinced everyone to stay back, he would have gotten into trouble. And he was also thinking about his parents. How mad would they be that he is staying back so late? 7 o'clock arrived, then 7:30. The class finally decided that they had waited long enough. Books were packed away, bags slung over their shoulders. And just as they were about to leave, the door suddenly swung open. Mrs. Sarojini walked in. Nobody knew where she had come from or seen her approach. She just simply appeared, walking to the blackboard and picking up a piece of chalk. One math problem after another, she wrote. The students immediately sat back down, just relieved that she had finally arrived. When she finished, she turned to face the class. Revise these problems carefully, she instructed. Don't waste time studying anything else. A few students exchanged puzzled looks, but the urgency in her voice felt unusual, as though she already knew what was coming. Throughout the lesson, the boy at the back of the class couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He noticed Mrs. Sarojini looked more tired than usual, one hand pressed against the pallu of her sari near her waist, as if she was hiding something. The sight stayed with him, unsettling him further. As the lesson came to an end, she looked around and said, "You may all go home now." The students gathered their belongings and began filing out. The boy, among the last to leave, suddenly felt a hand grip around his wrist hard. He turned around to see Mrs. Sarojini beside him. She had a look of fear, and her eyes bore into his face, almost as if she was pleading with him. Her sari pallu slipped, revealing a deep wound across her abdomen, the kind of injury no one could survive. The flesh appeared pale, lifeless. He tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. Her hands were icy cold. The classroom felt smaller. The air was heavy. Just then, another student appeared at the door. He had forgotten a notebook. The moment he stepped inside, he froze. Not because of the wound, but because Mrs. Sarojini was now hovering just slightly above the floor. The second student let out a scream, the sound echoing throughout the empty corridor. Mrs. Sarojini turned her head slowly. Her grip loosened around the boy's hand, and he bolted out of the class. The two boys ran, not stopping or looking back until they reached the road. The boy lived nearby. He pounded on his front door. His parents opened it, initially angry for him being late. But upon seeing him, their expressions changed. They found him collapsed on the doorstep, lifeless. By the next morning, word of the incident had spread. Most dismissed the surviving boy's story, claiming fear had gotten the better of him. Some suggested that he just simply made it up. Others insisted on a rational explanation. But then the newspaper arrived. According to the report, Mrs. Sarojini had died the previous day. She was struck by a bus while crossing the road on her way to school. The accident had been severe, matching exactly what the students claimed to have seen, which raised a troubling question. If Mrs. Sarojini had died before sunset, who spent the evening teaching math? My mom told me that the story faded with time. The families involved never spoke about it, and the school did not officially acknowledge what happened. Eventually, it just became another story passed from one generation to the next. But there is one final detail people still remember. A few days later, the state board exams began, and every single question Mrs. Sarojini wrote on the blackboard that evening appeared on the exam. The examination results were released. and for the first time in years, the boy had a genuine chance of passing. At least that's what people said, because he never lived long enough to find out. Whenever my mother told me the story, she always focused on one detail. Out of all the students in that classroom, it was the boy Mrs. Sarojini had spent years helping, who never made it home. The same boy she had stayed back to tutor. The same boy everyone called her favorite. Whether that means anything, I honestly don't know. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. But according to the story, Mrs. Sarojini returned one final time to help her students pass their exams. And when she left, she took her favorite student with her. In parts of the Gulf, there is an old warning people still repeat. If someone calls your name from outside after midnight, do not answer. And if the voice belongs to someone you love, be even more careful. I heard the story from relatives who grew up with that warning, and each person told it a little differently. But the heart of it never changed. If a familiar voice calls to you in the night, stay where you are. Do not step outside. Do not open the door. The story concerned a boy named Ahmed. One night, well past midnight, Ahmed woke to the sound of his mother calling him from outside the house. Ahmed. It was not a cry for help. It was not panic. It sounded ordinary, almost casual, as if she had stepped out for some small errand and wanted him at the door. Still drowsy, he got out of bed and started walking towards the entrance. And then he heard it again. Ahmed. This time, the voice seemed nearer, not loud, just closer. He reached for the lock, but before he could lift it, a hand closed around his wrist. Ahmed turned so suddenly he almost stumbled. His grandmother was standing behind him. She was not angry, she was afraid. In the dim light, her face looked drained, her eyes fixed on him as if she had caught him standing at the edge of something dangerous. Who are you speaking to? She asked, barely above a whisper. Ahmed looked at her, confused. My mother, he said. She's outside. His grandmother said nothing at first. She looked at him and then at the door. And in that small silence, Ahmed felt the mood in the house change. She pulled him back from the entrance, fastened the lock, checked the windows one by one, drew the curtains, and turned off the lights until the house was completely dark. The movement woke the rest of the family. His father came out first, still disoriented. Then his mother appeared. She was half asleep, asking what had happened. She had been inside the house the entire time. Ahmed stared at her. A moment earlier, he would have sworn the voice outside belonged to her, not resembled her, belonged to her. And now she was standing in front of him, alive, confused, and nowhere near the door. His grandmother gathered everyone into the sitting room and made them stay away from the windows. No one was to open the door, and no one was to answer if the voice came back. So they waited. For a while, the house was quiet. Then the voice returned. Ahmed, this time with everyone listening. There could be no mistake about what made it so disturbing. It did not sound like a stranger pretending. It sounded like someone who knew exactly how his mother spoke when she wanted his attention, gently, without urgency, certain he would listen. Ahmed's mother did not say a word. No one did. The call came again after a few minutes, then again later, never changing, never hurrying, as if whatever stood outside had all the time in the world. That was what wore on them most. If it had screamed, the fear might have broken differently. If it had rattled the door or banged on the windows, at least it would have behaved like something desperate. Instead, it waited, and every so often, from just behind the house, it called his name as calmly as before. Ahmed. The night became a matter of listening. No one slept. No one even tried. They sat together in the dark, measuring time by the spaces between those calls and by the slow arrival of the morning. When daylight finally began to thin the darkness from behind the curtains, the voice stopped. Not gradually, but at once. There was no sound of footsteps moving away, no last attempt, just silence. They remained where they were for several minutes, as if dawn alone was not enough to make the house feel safe again. At last, Ahmed's father went to the door and opened it carefully. Outside, the morning looked ordinary. The air was still. Somewhere nearby, birds could be heard. A neighbor was already awake. For one brief second, the whole thing felt impossible in the way bad nights often do once the sun comes up. Then his grandmother pointed to the ground. There, in the sand, was a single set of footprints. They started near the gate. They came straight up the path and they ended at the front door. That was all. There were no prints turning back. Nothing led away from the house. Ahmed would spend years trying to explain that night to himself. He always considered every ordinary answer he could think of. Maybe it was a prank, a trick of exhaustion, someone imitating his mother well enough to fool a sleepy child. But his grandmother never accepted any of those explanations. Whenever he raised the subject, she answered in the same quiet way. What stood outside was not trying to enter this house. She would stop there for a moment, and when she continued, her voice was lower. It wanted you to come out. Years later, not long before she died, Ahmed asked her one last time what she believed had been outside that night. She shook her head. Some things, she said, should not be named. Then she repeated the warning he had heard from her all his life. If a familiar voice calls your name from outside after midnight, do not answer, and whatever waits beyond the door, leave it there. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more forgotten stories from across Asia, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep your lantern lit.